Welcome back, everybody. We're now on the final leg of our megalithic marathon today, and we now have our keynote speaker for Saturday, Graham Hancock, who's going to be discussing themes from some of his earlier books. The title of the talk is A Species with Amnesia. Many of you know Graham's work through his documentaries, through his incredible historical investigations and the numerous books that he's written. And also recently he's got into novel writing as well. And today he's going to be exploring the lost civilization from prehistory. So please give a warm welcome to Graham Hancock.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. This is indeed a marathon, exhausting day. And I'll do my best not to just sort of fall over on stage, and I'm sure you guys will do your best to stay awake back there. One of the good things about being last is I can go on a little bit longer. I've got an hour, but, you know, I think maybe 2 or 3 hours might do it. I'll do my best to keep it tight. I've been involved in these mysteries for more than 20 years. I've had the incredible privilege and opportunity to explore and experience some of the most majestic monuments left for us to puzzle over by our ancestors. In all my travels and all my adventures, I've been accompanied and buoyed up by the presence of my wonderful, wonderful wife, Santha, who is as far as I'm concerned, the best human being on the planet, and I am so lucky to have her as my partner. She's been with me every step of the way, taken every risk with me, including some very extreme scuba diving as we got on to Underworld. The talk I'm going to give tonight will range across material that is in all 3 of these books. So if you want further information on them, that's the place to look. Unfortunately, none of my books are available here, but they can be obtained, of course. This is our beautiful garden of a planet, as we are familiar with it today. This majestic work given to us as a theater of experience to learn and to grow and to develop within. How incredibly privileged we are to be born in human bodies and to live on such a garden floating in the universe. It hasn't always looked the way it looks today. If you go back to the last ice age, which reached its maximum about 21,000 years ago, not so long ago, really, just the blink of an eye, you'll find that ice caps that are 2 miles deep sit on top of North America and also on top of Northern Europe. Now, all the water that's frozen into ice in those ice caps had to come from somewhere, and where it came from was the world's oceans. So as a result, during the Ice Age, the levels of the world ocean were 400 feet lower than they are today. All that water had come out of the ocean, it had been frozen into those giant ice caps, and when they melted, it went back into the ocean and sea level rose. So there's our familiar map of the world with its familiar contours. But if you go back to the last glacial maximum, 21,000 odd years ago, the world really does look quite different. For example, there was no Red Sea. It was all dry land. Nor was there any Arabian Gulf. It was all dry land as well. Australia was a much vaster continent than it is today, and Southeast Asia, now an archipelago of islands and the Malaysian peninsula, was at that time a giant continent-sized landmass. All of the coastlines of the world were extended much further than they are today. And altogether, 27 million square kilometers, that's about 10 million square miles of land, went under the ocean when the sea levels rose. That's roughly the equivalent of the size of Europe and China added together. Now, although the meltdown did take place over 10,000 years, there were within it 3 or 4 major episodes of flooding, when you could, in some cases, get as much as a 30-foot rise in sea level pretty much overnight. Now, you have to consider what a 30-foot overnight rise in sea level would do to our civilization today if it were to happen. I'm sure we've all seen the horrific and troubling images of the tsunami in Japan. And we can see the catastrophe that is unleashed by nature just by a temporary rise in sea level. So we have to imagine something like that, but on a global scale and permanent, and consider what it did to our ancestors and what effects it may have had upon them. I don't believe it's an accident that there are more than 2,000 flood myths pretty much all around the world. Memories of a gigantic global flood that almost wiped out mankind. Most archaeologists and historians are not very impressed with flood myths, and they take the view that these were little local events, perhaps a river flooded its banks, little local events which were then elaborated out by our superstitious ancestors who imagined it was a global flood. But I find that a completely unnecessary explanation, since we know that there was gigantic global flooding during the 10,000 years at the end of the Ice Age. And it seems to me highly probable that the world's legacy of flood myths are a memory of what happened at the end of the Ice Age. One of those flood myths was preserved by Plato, and that's the myth of Atlantis. He said he got it through his family line from the Greek lawmaker Solon, who had visited Egypt and had been told in Egypt of the existence of a high civilization in deep antiquity that had been destroyed in a global flood accompanied by tremendous earthquakes and volcanic activities. And this civilization, Plato said, was globally distributed, although focused on an island which he appeared to locate in the Atlantic. And he said that in a single terrible day and night, it was utterly obliterated. And that mankind was forced to begin again like children with no memory of what went before, that we were indeed a species with amnesia. The flood myth is found in India, where we have the Indian Noah figure, Manu, who is preserved by the god Vishnu to repopulate the planet, much in the way that Noah does in our Western flood story. And in Greece, it's the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who ride out the flood in a huge box. And again, their role is to repopulate the earth and to reestablish civilization. Similar stories have come down from the ancient Maya, who spoke of cyclical destructions and rebirths of the earth, and indeed the Aztec civilization as well. And of course, we all know the Noah story from the Bible. Now, it's well accepted by scholars that the Noah story is simply a later recension of an earlier story that came from Sumer, from Mesopotamia, the land that we now call Iraq. And that story is the epic of Gilgamesh. And therefore it's interesting, I think, to look at what happened in the Arabian Gulf, the region from which the Epic of Gilgamesh comes, to look at what happened in the Arabian Gulf at the end of the Ice Age. This, of course, is the Gulf today, and this is how it looked during the last Ice Age. That is not an inlet of the sea there. That is a large river system combining the streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which had a series of very fertile lakes running along its length, all of which was flooded in one gigantic incident approximately 12,000 years ago. So I'm not at all surprised that a powerful memory of a cataclysmic flood is preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Same is true with the Aborigines of Australia. We can see Australia today and Australia as it looked during the last Ice Age. Clearly, a huge amount of land has been swallowed up by the sea, and Aborigine myths remember this time and speak of a great flood serpent that ate up the land. As I say, I'm not surprised that we have these myths. I do believe we are a species with amnesia, and the myths are part of our memory of a huge part of our story that we've lost. But they're not the only part. There's much more controversial material. And that controversial material, some of it, is contained in ancient maps. And these maps suggest a level of technology and science that was far beyond the period in which they were derived. And before I go in more detail into the maps, I want to make clear that very often what we're looking at here are maps that were copied in the 15th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries from earlier source maps. And those earlier source maps have now been lost to us. We have the latest copies of them. And often those copies were adulterated by the copyists based on what they were learning about the world during the era of exploration. Sometimes they would impose what they thought was new knowledge on the old map and mix things up a little bit. Now, if you go back to the Dark Ages, 7th century and so on, this represents the standard of map-making technology at that time. These are called TO maps because of the T shape in the middle and the O shape around the outside. They're actually quite beautiful maps, but you would never wish to use them for navigation because they're completely useless for that purpose, although very nice for hanging on the wall. In these maps, east is oriented up, so this is the east side here, this is west, this is actually the Mediterranean Sea, this is Spain, and here's the Holy Land at the center of the world, as it were. So these are the TO maps, and that was the standard of maps that were being used 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century. But then, during the Crusades, something happened. It seems that a whole archive of other maps were released into general circulation and began to be copied. And at the same time, the maps of Claudius Ptolemy, who taught at the Library of Alexandria, which had been preserved in monasteries, were rediscovered and became the basis for the Ptolemaic cartographic tradition, reawakened in the year 1295. The other category of maps that appeared at that time are the so-called Portolan maps. And these Portolan maps are a real mystery. They are really incredibly accurate in terms of not only latitude, which really any culture can figure out, but longitude as well, which our civilization didn't crack the problem of longitude until the end of the 18th century. That's why before that, ships were constantly sailing into coastlines unexpectedly because they didn't know how far east or west of a particular point they were. But these maps, which began to enter circulation in the 1300s, probably from Constantinople, which in turn had probably received them from the Library of Alexandria, contain incredibly accurate latitudes and longitudes, spot on accurate as today's map. So it's quite difficult to see on this ancient map, but this is Italy here. We're looking at the Mediterranean. Very often you find that these maps do focus on the Mediterranean because that was an area of great interest to mariners at that time. But it's clear that they were copies they were fragments of much larger world maps. And Charles Hapgood, whose work I'd like to pay tribute to here, and his fantastic book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, traces the Portolan cartographic tradition through a predecessor of Ptolemy's, and through the Library of Alexandria into Constantinople, released during the Crusades, and then out to European mariners. As I mentioned, the source maps were often world maps, and one of them is this map, the famous Piri-Reis map. The bit that survived of this map is only the bit that shows the east coast of South America and the west coast of Africa. It was originally a world map. The other bits are lost. And in his own handwriting on the map, the map maker, Admiral Piri-Reis, who was a Turkish admiral, tells us that he had based his map on more than 100 older maps, none of which have come down to us. Now, of course, the Piri-Reis map is a very controversial map, but what is striking about it is the way that the continent of South America seems to join on to a landmass at its tip. And this landmass, I would suggest, is Antarctica, as it looked during the last ice age, when it was much more extensive than it is today. Now, this is Antarctica as we know it on our modern maps. And this is Antarctica as it was known on maps at the beginning of the 19th century. As you can see, it isn't there. And it isn't there because our civilization didn't discover Antarctica until the year 1818. So naturally, if you drew a map in 1805, it would not have Antarctica on it. But the really puzzling thing is that maps much older than this one do have Antarctica on them. And these are the maps that are copied from older source maps, often by quite well-known map makers like Orontius Phineas, here with his extensive continent of Antarctica, joining on to South America, and also the great Mercator, with his giant Antarctic continent, joining on to South America. It's larger than Antarctica today, but in broad outline, the shape is correct. And we have to ask ourselves, how did Mercator and Orontius Phineas know that? And the answer is they copied it from older maps. You can go into many details on these maps. For example, a Ptolemaic map from 1513 shows a little island lying off the west coast of Ireland. And this island is labeled High Brazil. And I know of a couple of expeditions that were sent out from Bristol, which is quite near where I live in Bath in the UK, to look for High Brazil. But they couldn't find it, not in 1513 or in 1613 or today. What you actually need to find that island is a time machine. And we can do that with geological studies of sea level rise, which show us that until approximately 12,000 years ago, an island of exactly the right size in exactly the right place did indeed exist where it's shown to exist on that Ptolemaic map. The Waldseemüller map shows a vastly extended Southeast Asia. And if we look at the details, I think it looks a whole lot more like this than it looks like Southeast Asia today or in 1507. And it's not confined to Western maps. This Chinese map of the Gulf of Korea is carved on a stone stela in Xi'an. And here we see a much narrowed Gulf of Korea with a little inlet marked at the top of it. And again, the latest geological evidence indicates that such an inlet did exist 12,400 years ago, before rising sea levels gave us the modern appearance of the Gulf of Korea. These two islands on this Portolan map from 1424 are really interesting. They're positioned by the mapmaker in the Atlantic Ocean, and they've given rise to many suggestions that these must have been the islands of Atlantis. There's Spain, by the way, there, and we know that over here is North America. But in 1424, all knowledge of North America had been lost long, long before. And people thought that if you sailed west from Europe, you would come eventually to China. That there was nothing in the way. That was the belief at the time. That's what Columbus believed. When he sailed west from Europe, he believed that he was going to come to Japan and China. And Professor Robert Fuson of the University of Florida has demonstrated really beyond a shadow of a doubt that actually these two islands are the misplaced islands of Japan and Taiwan. Located west of Spain, where at that time the prejudice was that they would find the coast of Asia over here. So actually what the map maker has done is he's mixed up information from what he thought was true and what he found on the ancient map, and he's placed Japan and Taiwan in the Atlantic Ocean. But the really interesting thing is, when are these maps of Japan and Taiwan? Are they maps of Japan and Taiwan in the 16th century, or are they something else altogether? And again, we need to resort to geology to solve this problem. And we can see here what happened to the island of Taiwan during the meltdown of the Ice Age. Here it is today, and here it is deep in the last Ice Age, when it was physically joined to the mainland of China, as indeed the government of China would no doubt wish it still to be today. And then we gradually see it separating off from the mainland as sea level rises. And 12,400 years ago, we find that a little island, which no longer exists, was placed here between Taiwan and China. So if we look at the map on the Pisagano chart, the map of Antillia, and compare it, we can see that it also has a little island lying to the west of it called Yamana. And if you overlay the two, you can see the similarities quite strong, but particularly the existence of that little island to the west, which is only known to us today because of the latest geological work on sea level rise. What's it doing on a map from the 15th century? The other island, Satanase, is Japan, but not Japan as we know it today. Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku are Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu are all separate islands today. But during the last ice age, they were all one island because sea level was much lower. And what's intriguing on this map of Satanase is that an inlet is depicted exactly where an inlet existed 12,400 years ago, and up here, this bay is also depicted exactly as it existed 12,400 years ago. Another 2,000 or 3,000 years, and that would become the island of Shikoku. But as it's depicted on this map, it's showing us Japan as it looked 12,400 years ago. So here's a general summary of the situation in East Asia during the Ice Age, the greatly extended coastlines, and we've been through the story of Taiwan. So that's why Santa and I were really intrigued when we were approached by people in Taiwan who told us that they'd discovered a huge structure underwater between Taiwan and China in exactly the area where that lost island once existed. And this is the diver who found it, Steve Shea. We went out and joined him on a series of dives on this enormous underwater wall, complete with battlements that lies beneath the sea between Taiwan and China, with a curious patio in front of it. And when you get up close, you can rule out any possibility that we're dealing with some kind of freak of nature here, because you can actually see the construction blocks that were used to put this wall together, very, very finely fitted together. So quite a mystery. If we now jump over from Taiwan to the most southwestern of the Japanese islands, to Yonaguni, we will find a whole complex of further structures underwater. Santha and I, over the years, have put in somewhere between 200 and 300 dives at Yonaguni. And what I want to do now is to just take you around the main areas where the monuments are, starting here and going up the coast here, and just show you what we saw there. Starting at the west side of the system of monuments, we have this curved roadway between two parallel walls. Another view of it here, you can see that there's some rather interesting blocks off to the side. It's a beautiful curved roadway and two parallel walls. Let's now swim over in this direction, swimming to the east, and I'm coming here to a tunnel, and I'm going to swim through that tunnel, and I want to show you what the inside of that tunnel looks like. That's what it looks like, with two giant megalithic blocks on each side placed on top of each other. When you get to the end of the tunnel, you find yourself looking at these parallel megaliths, which are slotted into the side of a rocky outcrop here. And if you were to believe the geologists who can't dive and who've never been to Yonaguni, you would be asked to believe that these had fallen from a cliff above perfectly into position there. The fact that there is no cliff above that point doesn't seem to deter the geologists in this explanation. It's an awesome place to dive. I've been to a great many sacred sites, and I feel very strongly when I'm diving at Yonaguni that I am witnessing an amazing sacred site that was submerged more than 12,000 years ago. Now here we have a huge rocky outcrop running away from these two parallel blocks, and I want to bring you round here to the most famous parts of Yonaguni, which is the terraced step pyramid-like area, which faces due south. And you can see that there are very regular angles and cuts into this. It is cut out of solid rock, much in the way that the Great Sphinx is cut out of solid rock. And again, the archaeological community is virtually unanimous in saying, no, nonsense, this is just a natural feature. This couldn't possibly have been made by human beings. There was no culture in Japan 12,000 plus years ago that was capable of making something on this scale. Again and again, when I hear people saying this, there are people either who are very poor divers, who've put in 1 or 2 dives at Yonaguni, or they're people who've never dived there at all. Anybody who really works extensively on these sites begins to get a different opinion. So the theory of geologists as to how this could be natural is reasonable in itself. The suggestion is that there are different layers of sedimentary rock here, and some of them are softer and some of them are harder than others. So when but before I go there, I just wanted to compare this with these structures from Peru, from Cuzco, which are cut out of solid rock and show the same sort of step pyramid terracing effect. Nobody argues that these are natural, but very similar structures underwater at Yonaguni are said to be natural because they disturb the picture of history. So the suggestion is that the sea, beating against this natural rock face, selectively removed the softer layers of rock and left the harder layers of rock, those steps there, giving the stepped effect. And I understand where they're coming from, but if they're right, then I want to find all the rubble that the sea removed from here. I want to find it down here at the bottom of the monument, directly underneath this area. But I don't, because when you look down from the terraced area, straight down below to a depth of 110 feet, what you see down at the bottom is a beautiful, clear pathway. I do not believe that nature was capable of clearing that rubble away, and indeed clearing it to the side, as we can see here, whereas the pathway is left clear and there are in fact gutters running alongside the pathway. So moving further west and north, we come to a huge underwater face. I've placed here one of the Olmec heads from Mexico, just to show the effects of a long weathering on a large stone-carved human head. Here at Yonaguni, facing south again, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. And I'll just take you around this very eerie and spooky place to dive. I'm in the shot for scale. You can see that it's a very large structure. In fact, the 2 eyes have got pupils carved into them, which you can get a hold of when you swim up close to it. Something almost terrifying about it, particularly in stormy conditions. And if it's made by nature, nature took care to separate off the head completely from the bedrock, so that we have the back of the head, and indeed to carve a headdress onto the top of this human face. And if we pull back further, we can see that it's set on top of a platform, and back again that the platform itself is part of a large open ceremonial area with another one of those beautiful straight pathways, again with gutters down either side. Now, it's not well known, but Japan, in fact, is a country littered with megalithic monuments and indeed stone circles, some of which are rightly attributed to the Jomon period of Japan, but some of which we really know nothing about. And this one, called Masadano Iwafune, the upside-down boat stone, is found in the Asuka area of Japan, beautifully cut on the top, halfway up the side of the mountain. Nobody knows its origin, nobody knows where it came from. It's just always been there as far as people can remember. If we go around to the other side of it, we can see the technique that was used to cut this very hard rock. And what they did was they cut these H-shaped sections out of it, and had they finished the job, which apparently they didn't do, they would have removed the areas that stand proud and left a smooth face. So it's interesting, since we do not know the antiquity of this megalith, that exactly the same technique of stone cutting is found underwater at Yonaguni at a depth which means that it's been underwater for at least 12,500 years. And this, to my mind, suggests we need to reevaluate some of the monuments above water in Japan. Going north from Yonaguni, we come to Okinawa. And just west of the main island of Okinawa are a group of islands called the Keramas, and off one of them, off Akajima, at a depth of 110 feet, is an amazing complex of stone circles. Some of the stones are very small, purposefully laid in spirals. These are in fact river stones that are lying there on the bottom of the sea. And others are cut down into the bedrock at the bottom of the sea and are on a very large scale, and these are they. It's really on an epic scale. It's a very difficult place to dive. The currents are ferocious, and sometimes we had to wait 5 or 6 days above it in order to be able to actually dive on it, because the currents were so severe that we just got swept away and we couldn't work on the monument at all. But as you get closer and look at it, you can see the central upright, and you can see the surrounding uprights, all cut out of the solid bedrock. There is no known geological process that can create this effect. Beautiful symmetry of the structure. And again, the way the outer curve, the inner curve here matches the outer curve of the central upright strikes me as particularly interesting. Let's go back to the Piri Reis map now. I'm sure everybody's heard of the famous Bimini Road. It's another one of those mysterious underwater structures that most archaeologists would like to be totally natural. They say it's just beach rock. But here's an interesting thing. On the Piri Reis map is depicted a large island in the place where Bimini is now. Bimini is just a tiny island today. But of course, it was a much larger landmass during the Ice Age. And although it's difficult to see here, I think you probably can see that something that looks exactly like the Bimini Road is depicted running right up the middle of this lost island. So the next question I want to ask is, it seems that somebody mapped the world during the meltdown of the last ice age. Did these people also have a religion? And interestingly enough, the Piri Reis map turns out to be centered on Giza. It's quite a sophisticated azimuthal equidistant projection, and it's centered on Giza in Egypt, where we find the majestic Great Sphinx and the pyramids of Giza. Of all the places that I've been privileged to travel, I would say that Giza has most touched my heart and had the most long-lasting effect upon me and upon my state of consciousness. These are truly magical monuments, and if you allow them to speak to you, they have so much to say. It's one of the few places, actually, that you can get a real sense that we live on a planet. You know, because if you place yourself at the base of one of the pyramids and adjust things so that a star is directly overhead and just stand there for 10 minutes, you'll just sense the earth rolling, and that star will shift away from the apex of the pyramid. There's a tremendous sense of connection between sky and ground at Giza, and it is indeed as though 3 stars have been brought down to earth. And speaking of stars, we shouldn't then be surprised to find that the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north, south, east, and west with stunning accuracy. The error off true north is just 3/60ths of a single degree. This astonishing precision in a prehistoric monument on this gigantic scale. It is a precision that we could achieve today, but any architect would ask the client, okay, you want to build a 6 million ton monument, but really, are you sure you want it aligned to within 3/60ths of a degree of true north? Because if you want that, then it's just going to cost you a whole lot more to make it. Very, very difficult thing to do. We can make you a big, fantastic monument, but please don't make us align it perfectly to true north. In fact, the alignment is so precise that we can be sure that the people who made it were familiar with navigation, that these are navigational levels of precision in the alignment. And also, there are hints of much greater antiquity at Giza than is allowed to the site by Orthodox Egyptologists. Now, as Antoine rightly said, Egyptologists prefer not to believe anything that the ancient Egyptians said. It's a strange thing. They almost seem to despise the culture they're studying. If ancient Egyptians ever say anything which conflicts with Egyptological dogma, the Egyptologists say, the ancient Egyptians were wrong about that. We're the ones who are right. So the Egyptologists dismiss this scene, for example, in the temple of Seti I in Abydos, where Seti I shows his young son, the famous Ramesses II, a list of all the pharaohs who'd ruled in Egypt before their time. Now, the interesting thing is that that list doesn't stop at around 3000 BC when Egyptologists say that the first dynasty began. It continues back beyond that, tens of thousands of years. It actually goes back more than 30,000 years before the time of Ramesses II. Right back to what the ancient Egyptians call Zep Tepi, the first time, the time of the gods, when Osiris ruled in Egypt. And here from the tomb of Seti I, we see Osiris on his boat of stars, showing the way forward to the followers of Horus, who will be responsible for carrying the Osirian religious tradition down through the future. If we go to the Temple of Horus at Edfu, itself a relatively late construction, but built on just the latest recension of a series of temples that go back into the dawn of time, we will find carved on its walls a massive body of texts. And these are called the Edfu building texts. Those texts tell us themselves that they were copied from an original text that had come down from heaven and was then much later copied onto the walls of this temple. It's a complete cosmology. And the Edfu building texts do indeed speak of a gigantic flood that destroyed the homeland of the primeval ones, of the gods, and that the survivors of this flood came to Egypt and made it the place where they would restart their civilization. And the first thing they did was they established mounds called primeval mounds all over Egypt, which were to be the sites of all future temples and pyramids. Of course, Egypt today we're looking at a culture that has 3,000 years of known history, from 3000 BC to around the time of Christ, and monuments within that period are all built around and on top of one another. It's an incredible mix-up, but some of the monuments that are attributed to the historic period, like this one, the Osirion, very near that temple of Seti I in Abydos, but 50 feet lower, had to be excavated from under the ground, I do strongly feel have been wrongly dated, and that these gigantic megalithic structures belong to an earlier period of construction in Egypt, indeed to the time of the gods. And here are just another view of this amazing Osirion that we find at Abydos. And of course, I won't go into detail in the work of John Anthony West and Robert Schoch on the geology of the Sphinx, but they really did stir things up back in the early 1990s when they showed that precipitation-induced weathering caused by exposure to thousands of years of heavy rainfall, is the only thing that can account for this very distinctive style of weathering in the trench that surrounds the Sphinx, and originally on the body of the Sphinx too, but it's been constantly restored. Indeed, the Sphinx was being restored, and we have historical records to prove this, in the time of Pharaoh Khafre, who is supposed to have built the Sphinx. So if he built it, how come it was also being restored during his reign? The suggestion is that the Sphinx stood on the Giza Plateau during a long period of heavy rainfall. And such rains have never fallen in Egypt since 3000 BC. You have to go back to the Neolithic subpluvial, the end of the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago or more, to find the kind of rains in Egypt that could have caused this distinctive weathering pattern. And there really is something, to my mind, archaic, something deeply ancient about the way this particular complex looks. Santha took this photograph from a helicopter hovering over the Sphinx temple and the Vali temple. So the three pyramids of Giza dominate the skyline of modern Cairo. And as we come closer, we see the Giza Plateau, we see the village of Nazlet al-Saman, which lies around the base of the Giza Plateau. We're looking now at the north faces of the three pyramids. Over here is the Nile Valley. Off to the west, the desert extends endlessly into the distance. Let's come closer now to the Great Pyramid. This is the entrance complex, the original entrance here, and the entrance forced by the Caliph Mamun in the 9th century. Closer still, you can see that the Great Pyramid is not complete, that there's a flat platform on the top of it with about half a course of masonry on the south side here. And closer still, Graham Hancock, a much younger man, standing on top of the Great Pyramid in roughly 1996. That was one of 5 climbs of the Great Pyramid that I was privileged to make, 3 of which were illegal and 2 of which were legal. The legal climb, you have to pull a lot of strings, then you have to sign a piece of paper at the bottom of the pyramid which says that in the event of your death, your heirs will not hold the government of Egypt responsible. But actually, the illegal climbs are much more fun. Up here on top of the Great Pyramid, that's the second pyramid, the Pyramid of Khafre behind me, you can see in these slabs at the top of the Great Pyramid lots of graffiti carved here. As a matter of fact, that map maker, 16th century map maker Mercator, he carved his graffiti on top of the Great Pyramid. It's still there. And there's just a whole lot of graffiti. And one step down on this side is a piece of graffiti that says the following: P. Hancock, 5 April 1916. My grandfather was called Philip Hancock. He was a chaplain with British forces in Egypt during the First World War. So I rang up my dad, who was still alive at that time, and I asked him to check my grandfather's diaries. Is there anything for the 5th of April 1916? He leafed through the diary, and he said, yeah, but there's just one line. I said, what does it say? He said, climbed Great Pyramid today. So, in a strange way, I met my grandfather on top of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Well, it's an amazing thing. The statistics are here for all of us to read. It's got a footprint of 13 acres. It's 481 feet high. It weighs 6 million tons. There were once 115,000 shaped casing blocks that went all around it, each weighing 10 tons each, but were knocked off during an earthquake in the early 14th century. And the angle of slope, by the way, this is the corner to climb, the southwest corner. That's the safest one to go up. The angle of slope is 52 degrees. I want to take you around the Great Pyramid, be inside it for a while, and we'll start down here in the subterranean chamber, which in fact lies 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid, and is approached through this descending corridor, somewhat more than 300 feet long, which slopes down at an angle of 26 degrees to reach the subterranean chamber that is carved out of solid bedrock. And this is what the subterranean chamber looks like. And the Egyptological view is that the pharaoh Khufu initially planned to be buried here, but for some reason, after he'd got his workforce to create a perfectly straight 300-foot-long tunnel, removing all of the bedrock from there and bringing it outside, that somehow when all of that had done and they'd started to cut the subterranean chamber, the guy just changed his mind and said, no, I don't want to be buried there after all. I want to be buried higher up. I think that the subterranean chamber, like everything in the Great Pyramid, has a very specific purpose. It looks exactly the way it looks because that's how the builders wanted it to look. And I think it's also deeply ancient and prehistoric. It's a fact that if you stand down here and have a colleague with a good singing voice sing in the king's chamber hundreds of feet above you, you can hear that person very, very clearly, quite spooky. So this is the descending corridor that comes down to it, cut out of solid bedrock, 350 feet long, almost perfectly straight, hardly any deviation at all from top to bottom, just fractions of an inch, and sloping at 26 degrees. So then we'll come up here, we'll come up the ascending corridor, we'll go along the horizontal corridor, and we'll find ourselves in the so-called Queen's Chamber. So-called because nobody knows what the function of this chamber was. Now, it has two famous little shafts in its south and north walls. If you'd come here before 1872, you would not have seen a shaft there because the last 5 inches of stone covering the shaft had been left in place by the builders. You'd have just seen a closed wall, but a British Freemason called Wayneman Dixon went around tapping on the walls of the Queen's Chamber, found these two hollow points, knocked away the 5 inches of stone, and found that it led into a shaft ascending up into the body of the pyramid, and a similar one on the north side of the Queen's Chamber. And my friend and colleague, Robert Boval, has shown that during the Pyramid Age itself, the epoch of 2500 BC, this southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber actually pointed at the star Sirius, where it crosses the meridian, the north-south line that divides the sky above your head every night. It pointed directly at it. The northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber pointed at Beta Ursa Minor, in the constellation of the Little Bear. And then there's 2 more shafts in the King's Chamber up above, which point at Alpha Draconis and at one of the 3 stars of the belt of the constellation of Orion. A German robotics engineer back in 1993 explored the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. He sent up the little robot with a camera attached to it, because these shafts are only about that wide and that high. No human being is going to get in there. And 165 feet up the shaft, the robot came to this door with 2 metal handles blocking the shaft. And at that point, Rudolf Gantenbrink's work was abruptly stopped by our friend Zahi Hawass, and Rudolf was expelled from Egypt, and no further work was done for many years. Zahi took over the project, and he commissioned the University of Singapore to make another robot, and that robot was designed to drill a hole through the door and find out what was on the other side of it. I often get the feeling that whoever made the pyramid is inviting us to explore it, but making that a very difficult thing for us to do. We have to use our ingenuity, we have to use our intuition, we have to use our intelligence if we're going to explore and understand this monument. So I'm not surprised that what they found on the other side of the door was a gap of about 3 feet and then another door. They're now trying to figure out how to get through that one and see perhaps if there's a chamber on the other side of that. Coming back out of the Queen's Chamber, we'll go up the Grand Gallery, this amazing and majestic cavity within the Great Pyramid with a corbel vault, blocks of stone weighing 50 to 60 tons each, perfectly positioned, sloped at an angle of 26 degrees. You cannot get a thin sheet of paper into the joints between the blocks. And up at the top, right at the top there, is the entrance to the antechamber of the King's Chamber, the so-called King's Chambers. There's a cross-section, top of the Grand Gallery, the antechamber, and you get through into the King's Chamber here. And above it are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 other chambers, which were rediscovered in the 19th century by a tremendous vandal called Howard Vyse, a British explorer who went around using explosives all over the Great Pyramid. He blew a huge gash into the south face of the Great Pyramid, and he also opened up here, right at the top of the Grand Gallery, a hole which actually turned out to lead into a tunnel system and led to these chambers up above the King's Chamber. And we'll go and have a look at those in a minute. Here's the King's Chamber itself. It's an incredible geometrical construction. It consists of granite blocks, 100 granite blocks, all of which was brought from Aswan, 500 miles to the south. The rest of the pyramid is limestone. You can see one of those shafts in the northern wall there. The sarcophagus in it, which is the only reason really for anybody to conclude that this was a tomb. Of course, it was not a tomb, and a sarcophagus may have another function altogether than that of burying a pharaoh, perhaps a ritual function. It's 17 feet 2 inches from east to west, 34 feet 4 feet 4 inches from east to west, 17 feet 2 from north to south. Perfect 2x1 rectangle, 19.1 feet high. And that ceiling has got 9 50-ton granite blocks in it. There's an interesting similarity between what's called the Djed pillar, a symbol of the resurrection of Osiris, and the design of this chamber system. And if we go into the chamber system, go right up to the top chamber, we can see lots more graffiti from 1915 there, Sister M.J. Martin, 6th of February 1915. And over on this wall, that's my daughter Layla, by the way. We were up there filming. That's one of those 50-ton granite blocks that she's sitting on. Up on this wall, there's lots more modern graffiti, but there's also some ancient graffiti. And that's the other reason, the only basis that Egyptologists have to attribute this monument to Khufu, is that up there in that hidden chamber is this piece of graffiti which more or less says the name Khufu in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. There is a really strong case to be made that that graffiti is forged, and that it was forged by Howard Vyse himself. It contains a grammatical error that was only present in Egyptology textbooks from that period. There are, however, and it's important to stress this, there is ancient graffiti in that chamber that's genuine, which disappears back between the joints, in the joints between the blocks. If you shine powerful lights in there, you can see that this strange writing goes far back to a point where no forger could ever reach. But this area in plain view, I believe it's highly likely that it was forged by Howard Vyse, who was desperate for a discovery, and he was able then to declare, I have found and proved that this is the Pyramid of Khufu. He got a lot of money for that. But this is the only statue of Khufu that's survived. It's about that high. He clearly was not a man with a giant ego. He did not inscribe his name anywhere else within the Great Pyramid, and obviously this is a problem. However, if you go to pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties at Saqqara, you will find an enormous amount of texts carved on the walls. Santa took this deliberately as a double exposure. There's the Great Pyramid of Giza in the background, and here's the chamber of the Pyramid of Unas, 5th dynasty pharaoh at Saqqara, which has the so-called pyramid texts carved on its walls. And I often think that these texts perhaps should be regarded as the software to the hardware that we see back here in the form of the Great Pyramid of Giza. And a close-up on some of these pyramid texts, very, very beautiful hieroglyphs carved into the walls, part of a very ancient body of liturgy. The pyramid texts are the oldest. We have the coffin texts, so-called because they are painted inside the coffins of the dead. We have the book of what is in the Duat, the ancient Egyptian afterlife kingdom. For example, in the tomb of Thutmose III, in the Valley of the Kings, a complete version of the book of what is in the Duat is painted. And the famous Book of the Dead, usually written on papyrus that was buried with the deceased. Actually, these are all one set of scriptures. They're just later recensions of the same ideas, which go on being explored and explored and explored through the whole 3,000 years of known Egyptian history. Tomb of Seti I shows the souls of Pe and Neken, a mysterious brotherhood that the texts tell us was responsible for transmitting and preserving the religion of Osiris. Osiris was the divine king of Egypt who ruled in the first time in Zep-Tepi, and he was murdered by his rival Set and by 72 conspirators. That number 72 is important. His body was hacked into pieces, and he was reassembled and revivified by his consort Isis through her magic. And we can see what's going on here. Isis transforms herself into a bird, in some versions a swallow, in some versions a kite. And she hovers over the phallus of Osiris and receives his seed, conceiving the divine child, Horus. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to read a little bit from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead concerning this scene from the Normandy Ellis translation of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. And here's how it goes. I stand before the masters who witnessed the creation, who were with Ra that morning the sun rolled into being, who were with Osiris in the grave as he gathered himself together and burst from the tomb, white with heat, a light and shining God. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that I may recall my years and weave together my history. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that I may form the characters of my own evolution. I stand before the masters who witnessed the generation, who were the authors of their own forms, who rolled into being, who walked the dark, circuitous passageways of their own becoming, who saw with their own eyes their destinies and the shapes of things to come. I stand before the masters who witnessed the working of magic, who were with Isis the evening she became the swallow, and her lamentations filled the air, who were with her as she shook down her black hair and veiled the god's transformation in secret, who witnessed the conception of the divine child, though his coming was yet unrevealed. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that when I speak the life of a man, I may give his story meaning. I stand before the masters who know the histories of the dead, who decide what tales to hear again, who judge the books of lives as either full or empty, who are themselves authors of truth. And they are Isis and Osiris, the divine intelligences. And when the story is written and the end is good, and the soul of a man is perfected, with a shout they lift him into heaven. Hail Thoth, architect of truth, give me words of power that I may complete my story and begin life anew. I stand before the masters who witnessed the transformation of the body of a man into the body and spirit, who were witnesses to the resurrection when the corpse of Osiris entered the mountain and the soul of Osiris walked out shining. He gathered his heel and his leg. He gathered his arms and his backbones. He knitted himself together in secret. He came forth from death, a shining thing, his face white with heat. Thank you. That's the Normandy Ellis translation of the Book of the Dead. She's she's an Egyptologist, but she's something that most Egyptologists aren't. She's a poet too. So she's captured the spirit of the original in a way that no other translation I know does so. So here we see Horus performing the rituals engendering the resurrection of his father Osiris, and thus the pharaoh Seti I, because this is in the temple of Seti I. Each pharaoh associated himself during life with Horus and in death with Osiris. He was the Horus king, and he became Osiris on his death. And here we have, again, that scene from the tomb of Seti I. Osiris became Lord of the Duat, God of the dead, master of eternity and immortality. And he's showing the way to the Horus kings, to all future pharaohs of Egypt who maintain the Osirian system. From the Dendera zodiac, another image, the square zodiac downstairs in Dendera, another image of Osiris. And there's no dispute amongst Egyptologists that Osiris was identified by the ancient Egyptian with the beautiful constellation of Orion. When they saw Orion in the sky, what they saw was the figure of the god Osiris. And he ruled over a kingdom in the sky, roughly between the constellations of Orion and Leo, and divided by the Milky Way, which the ancient Egyptians called the Winding Waterway. And my friend Robert Bauval, the author of the Orion Mystery, really, I think, has done probably the single most important service to the understanding of Egyptology in recognizing the connection between the three pyramids of Egypt and the belt stars of the constellation of Orion. And if we go to those same ancient texts, we can see that it makes perfect sense within the ancient Egyptian religion to bring down to earth the perfection of the heavens, as above, so below, to copy literally what you see in the sky on the ground. For example, in the book of What is in the Duat, we read of the hidden circle of the Duat in the body of Nut, the sky. Whosoever shall make an exact copy of these forms and shall know it shall be a spirit and well equipped both in heaven and earth. And that was the objective of the ancient Egyptians, was to become a well-equipped spirit. And the suggestion here is that we must have some knowledge of the afterlife realm before we venture there. In fact, the whole scheme looks like a huge device for transforming men into gods, companions of Orion, who navigate the Duat with Osiris. It was a region of the sky, but it was also a strange parallel universe, a kind of underworld through which the soul would travel after death, sometimes guided by the psychopomp Anubis, the guide of souls, and where all kinds of monsters would be encountered, questions would be asked which you needed to know the answers to. Anybody who tells you that the ancient Egyptians made up their ideas of the afterlife to give themselves comfort is talking nonsense, because the afterlife journey is really a terrifying journey where you must account for everything that you've done with your life on earth. It's not an accident that the ancient name of Giza was the land of Sokar or of Rostau, because we have here in the 5th division of the Duat an area that is referred to as Rostau, and which clearly features a pyramid, a sphinx, and some suggestion of some kind of chamber there as well. And if we look at paintings of the Book of What is in the Duat in the Valley of the Kings, for example, we can see that many of the features of the Great Pyramid are replicated there. The Grand Gallery, these narrow corridors and passageways, and of course that boat. And boats were indeed used for the navigation of the Duat. So to me, this makes a lot of sense as to why we find a large boat buried beside the Great Pyramid. And really, there are many, many parallels here. And I would suggest that this room, the King's Chamber, served the function of the judgment hall of Osiris, or also known as the Hall of Ma'at. And we can see that scene depicted here at Deir el-Medina. The deceased pharaoh is ushered into the judgment hall of Osiris. As I say, it's also called the Hall of Ma'at. Ma'at was the goddess of truth and cosmic justice. Her symbol is the feather that we see mounted here on her head. And prominently, these scales in which the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. And the objective, really important objective, would be that your heart should not be heavy with sin to outweigh that feather, that there should be balance in the scales, and that you should have lived your life in such a way that when you come to this moment, you're able to answer the questions that will be asked of you and justify your life. Up here, we see the 42 assessors in the judgment hall of Osiris. Each one of them will ask the deceased a question. All of the 10 commandments are there, but in negative form. Did you kill? Did you steal? Did you take the names of the gods in vain? And so on and so forth. They're all there, and 32 others as well. And ideally, you should be able to answer no to each one of those questions. Of course, we're all frail, we're all human. Most of us could not answer no to all of the 42 questions. But something else is going on here as well. It seems that in the judgment scene, it's necessary to have lived a moral and true life. But that's not sufficient on its own. There has to be something else as well. If your heart is heavy with sin, if you have spent your life infringing on the sovereignty of others, if you have spent your life causing misery and pain and destruction and disaster, then this is the fellow who will await you. He's called Amit, the eater of the dead, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, part lion. And he will consign your soul forever to oblivion, never to live again, never to return to earth, never to have a further opportunity to grow and to develop. And Osiris sits in judgment over the whole scene, and the god Thoth writes the verdict. It was called the weighing of words, and to cut a long story short, the suggestion that I would make about this is that the fundamental question beyond living a good life that's being asked of you is you were given an incredible opportunity to be born in a human body. You could, after all, have been a stone or a cockroach. You were born in a human body with this incredible brain, this incredible ability to learn and to grow and to develop, to create, to imagine. What did you do with that gift? Did you use it well, or did you waste it? Better not have wasted it in this scene. And I'm reminded also of a comment on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which has much to do with the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, and that is that meditation, love, ethics, none of these alone can bring about enlightenment without wisdom. So, a very powerful scene. And the ultimate objective was that the whole of life was preparing for this moment, and that one's ultimate destiny would be to become a star in the sky and to live the life of millions of years and to shed light and creation throughout the universe. So I'm suggesting that the monuments of Giza formed a sacred landscape in which a kind of simulator for the afterlife journey, in which preparations could be made, and one would enter this afterlife experience aware, prepared, ready for the difficulties that one would confront. And there really are astonishing similarities with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I will not go into further here. So I think we're looking at an ancient spiritual system that celebrated and nurtured the gift of life and that sought immortal life, but did not take it for granted. And what we're looking at here is the gift of life, of Ankh, eternal life, being given here by Isis to the pharaoh Seti I. If you ask the ancient Egyptians where this religious system came from, they said it came down from the time of the gods, from Zep Tepi. And actually clues as to when this Zep Tepi was are embedded in the architecture at Giza. And by the way, Santa took this photograph at dawn on the spring equinox. You can see the second pyramid. The photo was taken from the top of the Great Pyramid. You can see the second pyramid acting as a huge gnomon and casting its shadow due west into the desert as the sun rises due east on the spring equinox. Most Egyptologists will agree that, the ancient Egyptians had some knowledge of astronomy. After all, there are stars everywhere on the ceilings of the tombs. Here from the second shrine of Tutankhamun, we see the initiate joined to a star in the sky through the third eye. It's hard to think of an image that better sums up the ancient Egyptian love affair with the stars than this image. We need to have a knowledge of precession of the equinoxes to understand what is happening next. And of course, the Egyptologists don't accept that despite the fact that the ancient Egyptians were avid star watchers for thousands of years, they don't accept that they could have known about the precession of the equinoxes, which is thought to be caused by the pull of the sun and the moon on our planet, and it causes an actual wobble on the axis of our planet. And since our planet is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars, naturally changes of its orientation in space change the positions or the rising times of the stars at particular times of year. It's rather like a top which you've set spinning, and as the spin begins to decay, it starts to do something like that. So the extended north pole of the Earth transcribes a huge circle in the heavens over a vast period of time. It's just an accident that our North Pole presently points pretty much towards Polaris, our pole star. But there's been other periods in history when it's pointed at empty space or at other stars that have been the pole star of that period. And this is a very regular phenomenon. We can model it precisely with modern computer software, and it unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. It affects, of course, the pole star, but it also affects the background of stars against which the sun is seen to rise on the spring equinox. How am I doing for time here, by the way? Are we all right? I hope so. I'm losing track. As a result of the precession, the background of the stars against which the sun rises slowly changes. Back at the time of Christ, the sun was rising on the equinox in the constellation of Pisces. We've moved almost entirely through Pisces now, and within 100 or so years, the sun will be rising in the constellation of Aquarius on the spring equinox. That's why we live in the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And this change unfolds at the rate of 1 degree every 72 years. It's a backward motion through the zodiac. It takes 2,160 years to go through each sign of the zodiac. And the whole cycle, the great year, takes 25,920 years to unfold. Perhaps that was what's hinted at in this strange scene from the shrine of Tutankhamun. The Great Sphinx plays a key role in defining this process at Giza. And a later pharaoh, Thutmose III, who put this stela between the paws of the Sphinx, tells us that the Sphinx marks the splendid place of the first time. This photograph is taken from the Sphinx's back, That's the back of the Sphinx's head, looking east across the Nile Valley, perfectly due east, as a matter of fact. And we went back at dawn on the spring equinox for Santa to photograph it again. And you can see that the Great Sphinx is indeed perfectly aligned to the rising sun on the spring equinox. That's what it looks at. That's what the Great Sphinx is there to do, to bring together heaven and earth at that precise moment. So it's important to be clear that this precession, it doesn't change the rising place of the sun. It changes the stellar background behind the sun when it rises. It's a long, slow process back through the zodiac. 72 degrees, 72 years for 1 degree. If the Great Sphinx was built in 2500 BC, which was the age of Taurus, the logic is that it should have been in the form of a bull. It's very disturbing that it's in the form of a lion, but gazing at the rising sun at the spring equinox. And precessional software tells us that there was a time when the constellation of Leo housed the sun on the spring equinox, the Sphinx's celestial counterpart, and that time was around 10,500 BC. Also at that time, you get the precise correlation between the 3 stars of Orion's belt and the 3 great pyramids of Giza, and a perfect match between the Milky Way and the Nile. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the ancient Egyptians built the Nile. I'm saying that this site was chosen because of the happy relationship of the Nile to the Milky Way at that period of time. There's a very clear, using the universal language of astronomy, there's a very clear reference to a date here, and that date is around 10,500 BC. And the idea of using the stars to define dates is something we do today. It's been done at the Hoover Dam, as a matter of fact, where there's a huge piece of sculpture and a star map. And the artist responsible for the star map believed that in remote ages to come, intelligent people with knowledge of precession would be able to discern the astronomical time of the dam's dedication. And I'm suggesting that something very similar is going on at Giza. This mystery of precession is brilliantly explored in this book, Hamlet's Mill, by Professor Giorgio de Santillana of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Hertha von Deschend, who was professor of history of science at Frankfurt University. And what they showed is that a sequence of numbers relating to the precession of the equinoxes is preserved in myths and traditions all over the world, going back into remotest prehistory. And actually buried in their highly scholarly academic book, I had to read it 5 times before I understand it, is this statement that they trace this knowledge back to some almost unbelievable ancestor civilization of remote antiquity. So here are the numbers in the precessional cycle. 72 is the heartbeat of that cycle, but there's a whole range of numbers that you can derive from it. If you divide 72 by 2, you get 36. Add 36 to 72, you get 108. Divide that by 2, you get 54. 2160 is 72 times 30. 4,320 is 72 times 60, and so on and so forth. These are what I call precessional numbers. And as Santillana and von Deschend show, they're found in myths and traditions all around the world. A few examples there up on the screen. They're found in the famous Mayan calendar, which makes great use of precessional numbers. And they're found in the Great Pyramid of Giza as well. It's a simple fact. No Egyptologists dispute this. It is a fact. But they think, of course, it's a coincidence that if you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by this number, 43,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. And if you take the equatorial circumference of the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid and multiply by the same number, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So the dimensions of the Earth are encoded in the Great Pyramid on a scale of 1 to 43,200. And if that was some random number like 57,820, I'd be less excited. But because it's one of those precessional numbers that are found in myths all around the world, I think we have to accept that this is the deliberate intention. Moving on from there, If at the moment, the prime meridian of the Earth runs through Greenwich for historical reasons, but if you reset the prime meridian at Giza, a number of relationships that are hidden in the present setup immediately become clear. For example, Angkor Wat in Cambodia lies exactly 72 degrees of longitude east of Giza, one of those precessional numbers. And if we go to Angkor, which by the way means life to the Horus in ancient Egyptian, we find more pyramidal structures. Now, these structures were definitely built only about 1,000 years ago, in 1150 AD, but they stand on top of much, much older structures, which stand on top of even older structures. And actually, how far back into antiquity this site goes is not yet established. Look at this amazing straight line running here through the center of the Angkor complex. We're on the eastern side here, and we're looking to the west there. It actually disappears over the horizon. And if you position yourself on the west side of the causeway, looking straight at the tip of Angkor Wat, you'll find something interesting happening on the spring equinox. As the sun starts to rise, it slowly creeps up the central tower, and then it sits right on top of the central tower. And this is the moment that this whole majestic monument was designed to capture, to bring together sky and ground on the spring equinox. And many other monuments around the world do it in different ways. The Sphinx does it. There's Angkor. Here's the Pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. You can see the head of a giant serpent carved at the bottom of the step. And you can see this shadow effect running up the wall, which creates the body of the serpent. That shadow effect only occurs at 5:20 p.m. on the spring equinox as the sun is setting. The pyramid is perfectly positioned so that it will cast this shadow and complete that serpent, another equinoctial monument. There's 72 major temples at Angkor. Precessional numbers are all over the site in sculptures and in reliefs. We see here the churning of the Milky Ocean, where the serpent Vasuki is wrapped around Mount Mandara. Gods and demons pull on his body to churn the Milky Ocean, generating Amrita, the elixir of immortality, precisely the same thing that is being looked for at Giza. There's a judgment scene in this religious system, and there's Yama, the judge of the dead, depicted at Angkor, fulfilling the role of Osiris. And if we look down on the entire Angkor complex, something interesting emerges, which is that the principal temples appear to map out on the ground the constellation of Draco. And once again, they do so only perfectly in 10,500 BC, exactly the same date that the Giza monuments reflect. So we have a curious kind of three-dimensional game going on here, where shafts in the Great Pyramid point to stars in the northern sky that are mapped on the ground at Angkor, where Leo is rising in the east, Aquarius is setting in the west, constellation of Orion is at the lowest point it will ever reach in its precessional journey. Constellation of Draco is at the highest point in its precessional journey. Jump forward from 10,500 BC to today, and we find that everything has turned around the other way. Now it's Leo that's setting in the west, and Aquarius that's rising in the east. Now Orion is at the highest point in its precessional journey. Draco is at the lowest point in its precessional journey. It's almost as though they're drawing a deliberate connection between our age today and the age of 10,500 BC. And of course, I will not go into the Mayan calendar here, but I think everybody knows that the Mayan calendar predicts a great change of some sort coming up after the 21st of December 2012. Now, I'm not going around the world with a sandwich board strapped to my body saying that the end of the world is nigh. I do believe, by the way, we're nearly finished. I do believe that the Mayan calendar is misrepresented if it's said to tell us that the world will end on the 21st of December 2012. That is not what the Mayan calendar says. The Mayan calendar is a cyclical instrument, and each cycle runs for approximately 5,100 years. And the end of one cycle is the beginning of another. And so I think what's hopeful in the Mayan calendar is the notion that we can enter a kind of rebirth from this time, that a new destiny can lie ahead for humanity, that we don't have to go down into darkness, that we can write our own story and write it in a positive way. I'm one of those who believes very strongly that it's possible for a great change in consciousness to sweep this planet from time to time. And I think we're poised on the edge of such a moment when a great change of consciousness occurs. We're seeing the beginnings of it in the Arab world today, and we're seeing it all over the West as well, in small groups of free thinkers who get together and refuse to toe the party line. It all seems very small at the moment, but bit by bit, that change is coming. Nevertheless, thank you. It would be also a mistake to believe that we will go through such a great change without some difficulties. This is a time of trial that we live in today. I want to just do another reading, and then I will be just about finished apart from a few closing remarks. And that's from the Hermetica, which is a group of texts attributed to the god Hermes, who was the Greek form of the ancient Egyptian wisdom god Thoth, which were set down in Greek and Latin round about the end of the ancient Egyptian story. It was taking the ancient Egyptian wisdom and transmitting it forward into the New World. And there's one particular text called the Asclepius, which contains a passage called the Lament that I'm going to read for you now. It's called the Asclepius because Asclepius is the pupil of Hermes, and Hermes is giving this teaching to Asclepius. And he says, do you know, Asclepius, that Egypt is an image of heaven? Or to speak more precisely, in Egypt all the operations of the powers which rule and work in heaven are present in the earth below. In fact, it should be said that the whole cosmos dwells in this our land as in a sanctuary. And yet, since it is fitting that wise men should have knowledge of all events before they come to pass, you must not be left in ignorance of what I will now tell you. There will come a time when it will have been in vain that Egyptians have honored the Godhead with heartfelt piety and service, and all our holy worship will be fruitless and ineffectual. The gods will return from earth to heaven. Egypt will be forsaken, and the land which was once the home of religion will be left desolate, bereft of the presence of its deities. O Egypt, Egypt, of thy religion nothing will remain but an empty tale, which thine own children in time to come will not believe. Nothing will be left but graven words, and only the stones will tell of thy piety. And in that day, men will be weary of life, and they will cease to think the universe worthy of reverent wonder and worship. They will no longer love this world around us, this incomparable work of God, this glorious structure which he has built, this sum of good made up of many diverse forms, this instrument whereby the will of God operates in that which he has made, ungrudgingly favoring man's welfare, this combination and accumulation of all the manifold things that call forth the veneration, praise, and love of the beholder. Darkness will be preferred to light, and death will be thought more profitable than life. No one will raise his eyes to heaven. The pious will be deemed insane, the impious wise, the madman will be thought a brave man, and the wicked will be esteemed as good. As for the soul, and the belief that it is immortal by nature or may hope to attain to immortality, as I have taught you, all this they will mock and even persuade themselves that it is false. No word of reverence or piety, no utterance worthy of heaven will be heard or believed. And so the gods will depart from mankind, a grievous thing, and only evil angels will remain, who will mingle with men and drive the poor wretches into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and robberies and frauds, and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Then will the earth tremble, and the sea bear no ships. Heaven will not support the stars in their orbits. All voices of the gods will be forced into silence. The fruits of the earth will rot. The soil will turn barren, and the very air will sicken with sullen stagnation. All things will be disordered and awry. All good will disappear. But when all this has befallen Asclepius, then God, the creator of all things, will look on that which has come to pass and will stop the disorder by the counterforce of his will, which is the good. He will call back to the right path those who have gone astray. He will cleanse the world of evil, washing it away with floods, burning it out with the fiercest fire, and expelling it with war and pestilence. And thus he will bring back his world to its former aspect, so that the cosmos will once more be deemed worthy of worship and wondering reverence. And God, the maker and maintainer of the mighty fabric, will be adored by the men of that day with continuous songs of praise and blessing. Such is the new birth of the cosmos. It is a making again of all things good, a holy and awe-inspiring restoration of nature, and it is wrought inside the process of time by the eternal will of the Creator. There isn't a single ancient flood myth that I'm aware of, ancient cataclysm myth, that doesn't in some way implicate humanity. This is why I feel the matter is in our hands today. We do not have to face destruction and chaos and disaster. But if we continue to invite it in by our behavior towards one another and within our own lives, then perhaps we will. It's up to us to take this choice. We stand, I do believe, at the edge of an abyss right now. I don't know of any other civilization that looks more like the next lost civilization than ours today. But it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to go on repeating the same negative behavior on an international scale that we are practicing today. We can change. It is not a shortage of oil or coal or building materials or money that is bringing the human race down. It's fundamentally a shortage of love. That is what is missing in the world today. And that is what we have to bring back. It's very difficult as an individual to conceive of participating in changing the world. But what all of us can do is participating in changing who we are and in changing the immediate environment around us to be more positive and nurturing people. This is a choice we can all make. It's within our own power. Nobody can take that choice away from us. And if all of us make that choice, we will live in a better world. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. All of the coastlines of the world were extended much further than they are today. And altogether, 27 million square kilometers, that's about 10 million square miles of land went under the ocean when the sea levels rose. That's roughly the equivalent of the size of Europe and China added together. Now, although the meltdown did take place over 10,000 years, there were within it 3 or 4 major episodes of flooding when you could, in some cases, get as much as a 30-foot rise in sea level pretty much overnight. Now, you have to consider what a 30-foot overnight rise in sea level would do to our civilization today if it were to happen. I'm sure we've all seen the horrific and troubling images of the tsunami in Japan. And we can see the catastrophe that is unleashed by nature just by a temporary rise in sea level. So we have to imagine something like that, but on a global scale and permanent, and consider what it did to our ancestors and what effects it may have had upon them. I don't believe it's an accident that there are more than 2,000 flood myths pretty much all around the world. Memories of a gigantic global flood that almost wiped out mankind. Most archaeologists and historians are not very impressed with flood myths, and they take the view that these were little local events, perhaps a river flooded its banks, little local events which were then elaborated out by our superstitious ancestors who imagined it was a global flood. But I find that a completely unnecessary explanation, since we know that there was gigantic global flooding during the 10,000 years at the end of the Ice Age. And it seems to me highly probable that the world's legacy of flood myths are a memory of what happened at the end of the Ice Age. One of those flood myths was preserved by Plato, and that's the myth of Atlantis. He said he got it through his family line from the Greek lawmaker Solon, who had visited Egypt and had been told in Egypt of the existence of a high civilization in deep antiquity that had been destroyed with the Aborigines of Australia. We can see Australia today and Australia as it looked during the last Ice Age. Clearly, a huge amount of land has been swallowed up by the sea, and Aborigine myths remember this time and speak of a great flood serpent that ate up the land. As I say, I'm not surprised that we have these myths. I do believe we are a species with amnesia, and the myths are part of our memory, of a huge part of our story that we've lost. But they're not the only part. There's much more controversial material. And that controversial material, some of it, is contained in ancient maps. And these maps suggest a level of technology and science that was far beyond the period in which they were derived. And before I go in more detail into the maps, I want to make clear that very often what we're looking at here are maps that were copied in the 15th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries from earlier source maps. And those earlier source maps have now been lost to us. We have the latest copies of them. And often those copies were adulterated by the copyists based on what they were learning about the world during the era of exploration. Sometimes they would impose what they thought was new knowledge on the old map and mix things up a little bit. Now, if you go back to the Dark Ages, 7th century and so on, this represents the standard of map-making technology at that time. These are called TO maps because of the T shape in the middle and the O shape around the outside. They're actually quite beautiful maps, but you would never wish to use them for navigation because they're completely useless for that purpose, although very nice for hanging on the wall. In these maps, east is oriented up. So this is the east side here. This is west. This is actually the Mediterranean Sea. This is Spain. And here's the Holy Land at the center of the world, as it were. So these are the TO maps, and that was the standard of maps that were being used 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century. But then, during the Crusades, something
Welcome back, everybody. We're now on the final leg of our megalithic marathon today, and we now have our keynote speaker for Saturday, Graham Hancock, who's going to be discussing themes from some of his earlier books. The title of the talk is A Species with Amnesia. Many of you know Graham's work through his documentaries, through his incredible historical investigations and the numerous books that he's written. And also recently he's got into novel writing as well. And today he's going to be exploring the lost civilization from prehistory. So please give a warm welcome to Graham Hancock.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here. This is indeed a marathon, exhausting day. And I'll do my best not to just sort of fall over on stage, and I'm sure you guys will do your best to stay awake back there. One of the good things about being last is I can go on a little bit longer. I've got an hour, but, you know, I think maybe 2 or 3 hours might do it. I'll do my best to keep it tight. I've been involved in these mysteries for more than 20 years. I've had the incredible privilege and opportunity to explore and experience some of the most majestic monuments left for us to puzzle over by our ancestors. In all my travels and all my adventures, I've been accompanied and buoyed up by the presence of my wonderful, wonderful wife, Santha, who is as far as I'm concerned, the best human being on the planet, and I am so lucky to have her as my partner. She's been with me every step of the way. In a global flood, accompanied by tremendous earthquakes and volcanic activities. And this civilization, Plato said, was globally distributed, although focused on an island which he appeared to locate in the Atlantic. And he said that in a single terrible day and night, it was utterly obliterated. And that mankind was forced to begin again like children with no memory of what went before, that we were indeed a species with amnesia. The flood myth is found in India, where we have the Indian Noah figure, Manu, who is preserved by the god Vishnu to repopulate the planet, much in the way that Noah does in our Western flood story. And in Greece, it's the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who ride out the flood in a huge box. And again, their role is to repopulate the earth and to re-establish civilization. Similar stories have come down from the ancient Maya, who spoke of cyclical destructions and rebirths of the earth, and indeed the Aztec civilization as well. And of course, we all know the Noah story from the Bible. Now, it's well accepted by scholars that the Noah story is simply a later recension of an earlier story that came from Sumer, from Mesopotamia, the land that we now call Iraq. And that story is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And therefore it's interesting, I think, to look at what happened in the Arabian Gulf, the region from which the Epic of Gilgamesh comes, to look at what happened in the Arabian Gulf at the end of the Ice Age. This, of course, is the Gulf today, and this is how it looked during the last Ice Age. That is not an inlet of the sea there. That is a large river system combining the streams of the Tigris and the Euphrates, which had a series of very fertile lakes running along its length. All of which was flooded in one gigantic incident approximately 12,000 years ago. So I'm not at all surprised that a powerful memory of a cataclysmic flood is preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Same is true, we've taken every risk with me, including some very extreme scuba diving as we got on to Underworld. The talk I'm going to give tonight will range across material that is in all three of these books. So if you want further information on them, that's the place to look. Unfortunately, none of my books are available here, but they can be obtained, of course. This is our beautiful garden of a planet, as we are familiar with it today. This majestic work given to us as a theater of experience to learn and to grow and to develop within. How incredibly privileged we are to be born in human bodies and to live on such a garden floating in the universe. It hasn't always looked the way it looks today. If you go back to the last Ice Age, which reached its maximum about 21,000 years ago, not so long ago, really, just the blink of an eye, you'll find that ice caps that are 2 miles deep sit on top of North America and also on top of Northern Europe. Now, all the water that's frozen into ice in those ice caps had to come from somewhere, and where it came from was the world's oceans. So as a result, during the Ice Age, the levels of the world ocean were 400 feet lower than they are today. All that water had come out of the ocean, it had been frozen into those giant ice caps, and when they melted, it went back into the ocean and sea level rose. So there's our familiar map of the world with its familiar contours. But if you go back to the last glacial maximum, 21,000 odd years ago, the world really does look quite different. For example, there was no Red Sea. It was all dry land, nor was there any Arabian Gulf. It was all dry land as well. Australia was a much vaster continent than it is today. And Southeast Asia, now an archipelago of islands and the Malaysian peninsula, was at that time a giant continent-sized landmass.